It started with a Craigslist ad. Night shift gas station attendant wanted. Simple enough, right? I mean, I needed the money. And what kind of trouble could really happen in a small-town gas station on the edge of nowhere? Turns out trouble didn't need an invitation. It just showed up quiet and suffocating like smoke through a keyhole. I arrived at the gas station around 9:45 p.m. for my first shift. The place had the charm of an abandoned prison. Flickering fluorescent lights, a faint smell of gasoline mixed with something metallic, and a distant hum that sounded like it came from the bowels of the earth. "This is where optimism comes to die," I muttered, pushing open the grimy glass door. The manager, Greg, was waiting for me. Greg was in his 50s, thin as a scarecrow, and had the kind of face that looked like it had been through a bar fight or two. "Name's Greg. Don't expect much excitement around here," he said, not even glancing up from his clipboard. "Keep the place clean, don't let anyone steal, and don't go near the basement, got it?" "Basement?" I asked, half laughing. Greg looked up then, his eyes shadowed under the brim of his cap. "Just don't," he said with a tone that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He handed me a set of keys and left without another word. The first hour was uneventful. I stocked shelves, wiped down counters, and tried not to fall asleep standing up. Around midnight, the store went dead quiet. No cars on the road, no customers. Just the faint buzz of the neon sign outside. That's when I noticed something odd. The security monitors in the back office flickered, static swallowing the feed. When they came back on, the camera pointed at the parking lot was showing a man standing perfectly still, just at the edge of the light. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath fogging the glass. The man didn't move, didn't fidget, just stood there, hands at his sides, staring at the station. I walked to the front window to see if I could spot him in real life, but outside, the lot was empty. No one was there. Heading back to the monitor, I felt the air shift. It was subtle, like the way a room feels heavier before a storm. The screen flickered again, and now the man was closer, standing directly under the buzzing neon sign. "Okay, what the hell?" I whispered to myself. I grabbed the cordless phone off the counter and dialed Greg. "Relax," he said after a single ring, like he'd been expecting my call. "Don't talk to them, don't let them in, just wait it out." "Them?" I asked, but Greg hung up before I could press further. I returned to the counter, phone in hand, and stared at the front window. The man, if you could even call him that, was now standing inches from the glass. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes weren't right. They were empty, like a doll's eyes, reflecting the dim light without actually seeing. That was the first time I felt it, the suffocating weight of being watched, not just by something, but by something that shouldn't exist. By 2 a.m., the man, or thing outside, hadn't moved. His face was still pressed against the glass, lips slightly parted like he was waiting for me to do something. Every time I looked away, I swore I could hear faint scratching like nails on chalkboard coming from somewhere deeper in the station. I tried calling Greg again, but the phone wouldn't even ring this time, just static. It filled the room, low and menacing, like it had a pulse. I slammed the receiver down and grabbed the keys from the counter. If Greg wasn't going to answer, I'd lock the doors and deal with his anger later. The lock turned with a satisfying click, but when I looked up, the man was gone. I stared into the empty parking lot, my pulse hammering in my ears. The only thing left was his shadow, faint but there, on the asphalt under the buzzing neon sign. A shadow with no source. Then came the noise. It wasn't the scratching this time, but something worse. A deep, guttural groan that seemed to come from beneath the station. It vibrated through the floor, sending ripples across the half-empty coffee pot on the counter. I stood frozen, the keys biting into my palm. Greg's warning echoed in my head. "Don't go near the basement." I should have listened. The trapdoor to the basement was tucked in the supply closet, hidden under a stack of old, grease-stained boxes. I told myself I was just going to check if the noise was coming from the pipes. Logical. Practical. But when I pried open the trapdoor, the smell hit me. Thick and rotten, like something had been festering down there for years. The light switch didn't work, so I used the flashlight on my phone. The beam barely cut through the darkness, but it was enough to see that the basement wasn't just a storage space, it was something else entirely. The walls were covered in crude carvings, symbols and shapes that didn't belong to any language I recognized. In the corner, there was a pile of clothes, folded neatly like someone had planned to wear them. The scratching sound started again, louder now, and coming from behind a steel door at the far end of the room. I took a step forward, my foot crunching on something brittle. When I looked down, I saw shards of bones scattered across the floor. Human bones. Before I could process what I was looking at, the steel door slammed open. The flashlight caught a glimpse of movement, something low to the ground dragging itself toward me. Its body was all wrong, twisted and elongated, like it had been forced into a shape it didn't belong in. But the worst part was its face. It was the man from the parking lot, or what used to be him. His eyes still had that hollow, glassy look, but now his mouth stretched unnaturally wide, teeth jagged and too many. I stumbled back, the phone slipping from my hand and shattering on the concrete. The light went out. For a moment, everything was black, and all I could hear was breathing, mine and his, slow and deliberate. Then a voice, low and raspy, but unmistakably human. "Why did you come down here?" It wasn't the creature that spoke, it was Greg. Greg stood in the corner, his face half hidden by shadows. He looked older now, his features sunken like he'd been down here for decades instead of hours. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me with an expression that was equal parts pity and regret. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best effort to steady it. "What the hell is that thing?" Greg sighed, the sound hollow and tired. "You weren't supposed to come down here. Nobody ever does, not if they want to stay sane. That thing, it's not a man. Not anymore. It's what happens when you break the rules." The creature, if you could still call it that, dragged itself closer, its twisted limbs scraping against the floor. I backed away until my shoulders hit the wall, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But Greg didn't move. He didn't even flinch. "You fed it," he said, his voice heavy with accusation. "Fed it?" My mind raced. "I didn't." "The shadows," Greg interrupted. "The staring. It's all a test. It waits for someone to notice, to react. The moment you called me, it knew you were aware, and now it's hungry." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you warn me?" I hissed, anger and fear boiling over. Greg smiled faintly, but it wasn't kind. "Because I've been feeding it for years, and I'm tired of being the one it watches." The creature lunged. I ducked instinctively, its gnarled claws raking the air inches from my face. Greg didn't move to help. He just stood there, watching like he was already mourning me. I scrambled toward the trapdoor, the flashlight from my shattered phone flickering faintly across the floor. Behind me, the thing let out a sound that wasn't a scream but felt like it should have been, a deep guttural howl that vibrated through my bones. "Don't bother," Greg said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "You can't outrun it, not unless you're willing to trade places." His words barely registered. I reached the ladder and climbed like my life depended on it, because it did. The thing clawed at the trapdoor as I slammed it shut, its inhuman shrieks muffled but not silenced. The station was eerily quiet when I emerged. No hum of the neon sign, no faint whir of the air conditioning. Just silence. I grabbed the cordless phone again, hoping against hope that it would work this time, but all I got was static. The front door slammed open and I nearly jumped out of my skin. But it wasn't the creature, it was a customer. A kid, maybe 19, wearing headphones and looking annoyed. Are you open or what?" he asked, oblivious to the madness that had just unfolded. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the normalcy of his presence. "Yeah," I stammered. "Coffee's in the back." As the kid wandered off, I glanced at the monitor in the back office. The feed was normal. No flickering, no static. Just the empty parking lot. But when I looked closer, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. Greg was outside now, standing under the neon sign with that same hollow-eyed stare. The realization hit me like a freight train. He had traded places with me. I grabbed my jacket and bolted, leaving the station and whatever was lurking beneath it behind. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The gas station was already fading into the darkness, but I could still see Greg standing there, his face illuminated by the flickering neon light. He smiled. The hospital at night feels like a different world. During the day, the corridors are bustling, filled with the steady rhythm of footsteps and voices. But on the night shift, silence seeps into every corner, broken only by the faint hum of machines and the occasional squeak of a nurse's sneakers. I clocked in at 11:45 p.m., mentally preparing for another quiet yet unnerving shift in the psychiatric ward. I worked alone in the East Wing, an older, rarely used section of the hospital. The dim, fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly as I made my rounds, clipboard in hand. Most patients were sedated or asleep, their muffled breathing barely audible through the heavy doors. Everything seemed routine at first. Around 2 a.m., I stopped at room 405 to check on an elderly woman named Mrs. Holloway. She was harmless, but prone to muttering to herself about shadows and visitors in the dark. As I entered, her head snapped toward me, her eyes, wide and glassy, locked onto mine. "He's here again," she whispered hoarsely. "Don't you feel it?" "Mrs. Holloway, there's no one here but us," I said softly, checking her vitals. She grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, her frail fingers digging into my skin. "He always comes on the third night," she hissed. "Listen for the hum. That's how you'll know." Her words lingered like a warning as I left the room, unease crawling its way into my thoughts. Back at the nurse's station, I reviewed the security feed out of habit. Everything seemed normal until a flicker caught my eye. The camera in the East Wing stairwell glitched, showing static for a moment before returning to normal. But in that brief flicker, I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting unnaturally fast. I leaned closer, replaying the footage frame by frame. My hands trembled as I noticed something impossible. A figure standing at the base of the stairwell, motionless, yet no alarms had been triggered. The intercom crackled suddenly, a garbled noise breaking the silence, followed by a faint rhythmic hum. The rhythmic hum lingered in the air, low and unsettling. I stepped out of the nurse's station, scanning the corridor. It was empty, but the sound seemed to pulse from somewhere nearby, growing louder with each step. It wasn't mechanical, more like something vibrating just beyond the edge of hearing. I headed toward the East Wing stairwell, flashlight in hand. My footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor as I pushed the door open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit staircase. The sound was gone now, replaced by an oppressive stillness. I descended slowly, my grip tightening on the rail as the faint scent of bleach and metal filled my nose. At the base of the stairs, I paused, listening. Then a faint shuffle, someone was down there. "Security!" I called out, my voice firm. No response. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the small landing, catching sight of scuffed boot prints leading into the storage area. My pulse quickened. This wasn't a patient. It had to be someone who slipped past the night guards. Pushing open the storage door, I found the room cluttered with old medical equipment. The air was stale, heavy with dust and something else, something faintly metallic. In the far corner, a figure stood partially hidden behind a row of shelves. I could only see the edge of a shoulder and a hand resting on the metal frame. "Hey!" I barked, stepping closer. "You're not supposed to be here." The figure didn't move, but I could hear their breathing now, slow and deliberate. My throat tightened as I realized they weren't startled. They were waiting. I stopped a few feet away, flashlight aimed at the figure's back. "Turn around now," I ordered, my voice steady. Slowly they shifted, stepping into the light. He was tall, his face partially obscured by a black mask, the kind construction workers wear. His eyes, however, were bare, and they locked onto mine with an unsettling calm. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice low and gravelly, echoing my own words back at me. His hands were empty, but something about his stance radiated threat. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, calculating my options. Before I could speak, he took a step forward, and I instinctively backed up. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice now edged with the panic I tried to suppress. He didn't answer, but tilted his head slightly as though studying me. "Third night," he muttered, almost to himself before taking another step. "It's always the third night." The man's words sank in, and the chill of understanding gripped me. Mrs. Holloway had said the same thing. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as he took another step forward, closing the gap between us. His presence felt calculated, deliberate, like he knew every move I'd make before I did. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice sharp, masking the fear creeping in. He didn't respond, but his eyes flicked to the flashlight in my hand. "You're not supposed to be here," I said again, louder this time, as if volume alone could restore the balance of power. The hum started again, faint but unmistakable, as though it emanated from the walls themselves. The man cocked his head slightly, listening. "You hear it now, don't you?" he said, his voice low but steady. "It means it's too late." I stepped back, my heels hitting the base of the stairwell. "Too late for what?" I pressed, trying to keep him talking, hoping someone would notice my absence and come looking. He smiled, a faint, unnerving curve of his lips beneath the mask. "For you to walk away." The lights above flickered, and I seized the moment to bolt up the stairs. My breaths came in sharp, ragged gasps as I reached the top and slammed the door shut behind me. I fumbled for my phone, only to remember the line had gone dead earlier. Footsteps echoed up the stairwell, slow, deliberate. My hands shook as I grabbed a metal chair and wedged it beneath the doorknob. I backed away, my eyes locked on the door as it rattled under the weight of a heavy push. "You can't stop it," his muffled voice called from the other side. Third nights always end the same. I turned and ran down the corridor, stopping only when I reached the nurse's station. I hit the emergency call button, setting off alarms that blared through the ward. Doors slammed open as patients stirred, shouting and stumbling into the halls. Suddenly, silence. The alarm stopped mid-blare and the lights dimmed, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. I spun around, searching for any sign of the masked man, but the corridor was empty now. Then, from behind me, a quiet voice. "You can't outrun what's coming." I whipped around, but there was no one there. The only sound was my own breathing, heavy and uneven. By the time security arrived, the ward was in chaos, but the masked man was gone. Only the faint hum remained, echoing in my mind long after the shift ended. The third night always ends the same, I thought, unsure if I had escaped or merely delayed whatever was coming next. When Billy handed me the night shift at her diner, she warned me with a chuckle. "Don't let the graveyard hour mess with your head." It wasn't a real warning, though. Just the kind of joke you'd expect from a boss who thought she was hilarious. The first few nights were quiet, uneventful even. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and the faint smell of burnt coffee hung in the air like an old song stuck on repeat. It was always the same handful of customers, a trucker here, a night owl there, the occasional police officer stopping in for pie and coffee. By my third week, the routine felt as predictable as the tick of the old clock hanging above the counter. Until that Thursday night, when he walked in. He wasn't the kind of guy you'd notice right away. Average height, plain clothes, a face that could blend into any crowd. But something about the way he moved caught my attention. He didn't stride in confidently like most customers. Instead, he paused at the door, scanning the diner like he was searching for something specific. Or someone. "Welcome in," I said, keeping my tone light. He didn't respond. He walked to the counter, took a seat on the stool closest to the door, and folded his hands neatly on the counter. His knuckles were pale and tight, like he'd been gripping something hard moments before. I grabbed a menu and set it in front of him. "What can I get you tonight?" "Just coffee," he said. His voice was low but steady. The kind of voice that made you think he'd seen his fair share of bad nights. I poured him a cup, my eyes darting back to him now and then. Something was off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at the clock, or the way his gaze flicked toward the empty booths as if expecting someone to appear. "Long night?" I asked, trying to make small talk. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee and winced like it was too bitter, even though I'd just brewed a fresh pot. "You work here alone?" he asked, ignoring my question. "Most nights," I said, suddenly feeling the weight of the empty diner. "Why?" He smiled faintly but didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old watch. It wasn't the kind you'd see at a store. This one looked ancient, the metal scratched and tarnished. He placed it on the counter and nudged it toward me. "Mind holding on to this for me?" I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. "Excuse me?" "I can't keep it anymore," he said, his tone matter of fact. "It's safer here." "Safer?" I repeated, feeling a flicker of unease. "Look, I don't know what kind of game this is, but..." The bell above the door jingled, cutting me off. I turned instinctively, expecting another late-night customer, but the diner was empty. When I turned back to the counter, the man was gone. The cup of coffee sat untouched, still steaming, and in its place the old watch ticked faintly, its hands moving backward. I didn't touch the watch for hours after the man left. It just sat there, ticking backward, its faint clicks louder than they had any right to be. I finished the shift feeling uneasy, but I convinced myself that he'd just forgotten it. People leave behind weird stuff all the time. The watch was probably just broken, a coincidence that would make sense when I wasn't sleep-deprived. The next night, I almost forgot about it. The diner was busier than usual. 2 truckers arguing about fuel prices, a couple whispering heatedly in a corner booth, and Billy stopping by to grab the cash register receipts. "Everything all right, kid?" she asked when she caught me staring too long at the counter where the watch had been. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." I didn't mention the watch. It wasn't there anymore. When I came in that evening, it was gone, and I figured Billy must have moved it or thrown it out. But by 2 a.m., the rush died down and I was alone again. That's when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up expecting another customer, but it was the same man. Same plain clothes, same average face. He didn't hesitate this time, just walked straight to the counter and sat in the same stool as the night before. "Coffee?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He nodded, his hands resting flat on the counter. They weren't trembling, but something about the way his fingers twitched made me uneasy. I poured him a cup and slid it over, watching him out of the corner of my eye. "Did you forget something last night?" I asked, trying to sound polite. He didn't respond at first. He just stared into the coffee, the steam curling up around his face. Finally, he said, "It's quiet tonight." "Yeah, usually is," I said, not liking how he dodged my question. "You didn't touch it, did you?" he asked suddenly, his voice sharper than before. "What?" "The watch," he said, looking up at me now. His eyes were dark, intense. "You didn't take it with you, right?" I shook my head. "No. It was gone when I came in. Did you take it back?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, pulling something from his pocket. It was a folded piece of paper, creased and worn. He slid it across the counter to me, his expression unreadable. "What's this?" I asked, but he didn't stick around to explain. Before I could stop him, he turned and walked out of the diner, the door jingling faintly behind him. I unfolded the paper, my stomach knotting. It was a list, 7 names, written in shaky handwriting. Mine was the last one. For a moment, I just stared at the paper, trying to make sense of it. The other names meant nothing to me, but seeing my own at the bottom sent a wave of dread crawling up my spine. It wasn't just the name. Next to it, someone had scrawled the word, "Tonight." The diner suddenly felt too quiet, the fluorescent lights too bright. I looked around, half expecting to see the man watching me from outside. But the street was empty. Just the faint hum of a distant car and the flicker of the neon sign above the door. I grabbed my phone and dialed Billy. She picked up on the 3rd ring, her voice groggy. "What's up?" "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Did you move the watch from the counter last night?" There was a pause on the other end. "What watch?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the sound of glass shattering in the back made me drop the phone. I spun around, heart pounding, and stared at the kitchen door. It swung slightly on its hinges, as though someone had just passed through. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the swaying kitchen door. The sound of shattered glass echoed in my head, sharp and clear. The diner was empty. At least it was supposed to be. My hands felt clammy as I grabbed the first thing within reach, a metal spatula from the counter. Not much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. "Hello?" My voice felt small against the oppressive silence. I forced myself to step toward the kitchen, the tile floor cold and sticky beneath my shoes. The air back there smelled wrong, like burnt grease mixed with something metallic. The broken glass came from the far side of the kitchen, near the walk-in fridge. A pile of shattered plates lay on the floor, glittering like jagged snow under the dim light. I strained my ears, listening for any movement, but the only sound was the distant hum of the fridge motor. I crept closer, my heart pounding like a hammer in my chest. Then I saw it, a faint scuff mark on the floor, leading toward the back exit. Someone had been here, and they hadn't even bothered to be subtle about it. My breath hitched as I reached for the door handle. It was unlocked, swinging open with a slight creak when I pulled. The alley behind the diner was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb above the door. The dumpsters were pushed against the wall, their lids slightly ajar, and the air was heavy with the smell of rotting food. I stepped outside, gripping the spatula tighter. "Hey, if someone's out here, you better come out now!" My voice echoed off the brick walls, sounding braver than I felt. There was a rustling sound near the dumpsters, and I snapped toward it. For a moment, I thought it was just a raccoon or a stray cat, but then I saw the shape. Tall, human, and unmistakably out of place. The figure stepped out from behind the dumpster, and my stomach dropped. It was the man from earlier, the one with the watch, but something about him was different now. His posture was rigid, his face a mask of cold detachment. He didn't look like the nervous man from before. He looked, intentional. "You shouldn't have opened the door," he said, his voice calm and measured. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me. "You shouldn't have been on the list." "What list?" I snapped, anger bubbling up through my fear. "Why is my name on it? What is this about?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and glinting. At first, I thought it was the watch again, but it wasn't. It was a knife, the blade catching the faint light from above. "Wait," I said, holding up my hands. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but I don't want any trouble." "Neither do I," he said. "But trouble has a way of finding people like us." I didn't wait to hear what he meant. I bolted back inside the diner, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled with the lock, twisting it into place just as the handle jiggled violently. "Open the door," his voice called out from the other side, eerily calm despite the force he was using. I grabbed my phone from the counter and dialed 911, my fingers shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The operator picked up, but before I could get a word out, the back door's lock gave way with a loud crack. I ran. The diner wasn't big, but I knew it better than he did. I slipped into the small supply closet near the front, shutting the door as quietly as I could. My breath came in shallow bursts as I pressed my ear to the door, listening for his footsteps. The silence stretched out, every second feeling like an eternity. Then I heard it, the faint squeak of his shoes against the tile. He was inside, moving slowly, deliberately. "You can't hide forever," he said, his voice drifting through the diner. "This isn't personal, it's just necessary." I tightened my grip on the phone, whispering my location to the operator and praying they'd send someone fast. The footsteps grew closer, pausing just outside the closet door. I held my breath, my pulse roaring in my ears. The handle turned slightly, but before it could open, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the diner windows, and for the first time that night, I felt a sliver of hope. The man didn't wait around. I heard the back door slam as he bolted, and within seconds the cops were swarming the place. They didn't find him. All they found was the knife he'd left behind, still glinting on the counter where he'd sat earlier. I quit the diner the next morning. Billy tried to convince me to stay, but there was no way I'd ever set foot in that place again. Some nights, though, I still dream about him. His calm voice, his sharp blade, and the list with my name on it. I never did figure out why I was on it, but one thing's for sure, I don't want to know who's next. Working the night shift at the mall sounded like an easy gig when I first signed up for it. I was broke, and the promise of good pay for sitting in an empty building was too tempting to pass up. The job was straightforward. Walk the halls, check the security cameras, and lock up. Nothing more, nothing less. But I quickly learned that the emptiness of a place can weigh on you in ways you don't expect. It started on my third night. The mall was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you notice your own breathing. The shops, with their metal shutters pulled down, looked like lifeless cages. My routine was the same. Check the cameras, do a lap around the building, and then sit in the security office until the next round. That night, I was halfway through my patrol when I heard something, a faint noise, like shuffling footsteps coming from the food court. My first thought was that someone had stayed behind after closing, a maintenance worker or a straggling shopper. I called out, "Hello? Mall security? Anyone there?" My voice echoed, but no one responded. I hesitated for a moment before heading toward the sound. The food court was bathed in dim emergency lighting, the shadows stretching across the empty tables and chairs. The smell of grease from the fryers lingered faintly in the air. I scanned the area, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. A single tray sat in the middle of a table, its contents untouched. A burger and fries, fresh enough that steam was still rising from the food. My stomach churned, not from hunger, but from the sheer impossibility of it. The mall had closed hours ago. No one had been here to make that meal. I radioed my coworker, Jim, who was supposed to be monitoring the cameras back in the office. "Jim, you seeing this? Someone left a fresh tray in the food court." Static crackled, followed by his voice. "What are you talking about? There's no one on the cameras." "Check again," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. A pause. Then, nothing. Place is dead. I wanted to believe him, but the sight of that tray made it hard. "I'm heading back to the office," I muttered, turning on my heel. As I walked, the sound of my footsteps seemed too loud, too deliberate, like they didn't belong to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I made it back to the security office, my nerves were on edge. Jim was sitting at the desk, staring at the monitors. He looked up when I walked in, his face pale. "You good?" he asked. I nodded, but my eyes were glued to the screens. The food court camera showed the tray still sitting there, untouched. But in the corner of the frame, just barely visible, was a figure. Someone standing in the shadows, motionless. "Who the hell is that?" I asked, pointing at the screen. Jim frowned. "What are you talking about? There's no one there." I leaned closer, my finger hovering over the figure. "Right there, by the edge of the frame." He shook his head. "I don't see anything." I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was messing with me, but the look on his face told me he wasn't. I turned back to the screen and my stomach dropped. The figure was gone. The air in the security office felt stifling, thick with tension neither Jim nor I could shake. I replayed what I saw in my head over and over. The figure standing at the edge of the camera, motionless, and then gone. Jim tried to laugh it off, calling it a glitch or my imagination, but he didn't seem convinced, and neither was I. "All right," I said, standing. "I'm doing another round. If someone's in here, I'm not sitting around waiting for them to get bold." Jim grunted but didn't argue. I grabbed the flashlight again and headed into the mall. The hall seemed darker now, as if the emergency lights were struggling to keep the shadows at bay. My footsteps echoed and every sound felt amplified. The hum of the air conditioning, the creak of the floor beneath my boots, even the faint buzz of a dying light bulb overhead. I decided to start with the food court. When I arrived, the tray was gone. The table was empty, wiped clean like it had never been there. My stomach turned as I scanned the room. I couldn't even convince myself that I'd imagined it. Jim had seen it on the monitor too. A noise broke my thoughts. It was faint, coming from upstairs, like metal scraping against metal. I froze, holding my breath to hear better. It sounded like it was coming from the department store on the second floor, the one with the shattered escalator no one had bothered to fix. I took the stairs two at a time, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The department store was sealed off with metal shutters, but I could see through the small gaps in the slats. Inside, it was dark, the shelves looming like silent sentinels. I pressed my ear to the shutter, listening. That's when I heard it again, the scraping sound followed by a faint rhythmic thudding. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I grabbed my radio. "Jim, someone's in the department store upstairs. I need you to check the cameras." Static. Then his voice came through, low and tight. "There's no one on the cameras." "Check again," I hissed. "I already did," he snapped. "There's nothing there, man." "You sure you're not just hearing the AC or something?" I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "I know what I heard. It's coming from the store. Get up here if you're not going to help me from the office." Jim didn't respond. Frustrated, I decided to walk around to the emergency exit that led into the store. My keys jingled as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of stale air and plastic hit me immediately. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of mannequins, their lifeless faces turned toward me as if they were watching. The sound was louder now, scraping, dragging, and that steady thud. It was coming from the stockroom at the back of the store. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to leave this for the morning crew, but my pride wouldn't let me. I approached the stockroom, the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open with the flashlight, I scanned the space. It was cluttered with boxes and racks of clothing, but nothing seemed out of place. The noise had stopped. Then I noticed it. Faint marks on the floor, like something had been dragged. They led to a large supply closet. I swallowed hard and stepped toward it, my fingers gripping the handle. With one quick motion, I yanked the door open. The closet was empty. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A piece of paper on the floor, half hidden under a box. I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling. It was a mall map, but certain stores were circled in red marker. The food court, the department store, and the security office. My radio crackled to life. "Hey!" Jim's voice came through, panicked. "Someone's outside the office. I can hear them trying to get in." I bolted out of the department store, the map still clenched in my hand. Jim's voice on the radio was frantic. "They're banging on the door, man. Get back here." "Stay inside," I barked into the radio as I sprinted down the empty halls. "Don't open that door for anyone. I'm coming." The mall felt alive in the worst way. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound amplified. My flashlight swayed wildly, casting erratic beams across storefronts. When I reached the security office, the banging had stopped. The silence was deafening. "Jim?" I called, easing the door open. The room was empty. My chest tightened as I scanned the monitors. The live feeds showed nothing unusual, just the still deserted mall. The chair where Jim had been sitting was knocked over, and his radio lay abandoned on the desk. "Jim!" I yelled, louder this time. No answer. My hand hovered over the phone, ready to call the police, when something caught my eye on the monitors. The camera outside the office flickered, and for a split second I saw him. The figure from earlier, standing just at the edge of the frame. He wasn't moving, just staring at the office door. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, but the line wouldn't connect. Static buzzed in my ear, mocking me. I slammed the receiver down and grabbed my flashlight again, my palms slick with sweat. I stepped out of the office, every nerve in my body on high alert. The halls stretched out before me, quiet and empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. That's when I saw the trail. Smears of something dark. Blood, maybe. Led from the office down the hall, disappearing into the shadows. My stomach twisted, but I followed it, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. The trail led to a small maintenance corridor, one I rarely used. The door was slightly ajar, the dim light inside flickering. I pushed it open and stepped inside. "Jim?" I called, my voice shaking. The corridor was narrow, lined with cleaning supplies and tools. At the far end, something was slumped against the wall. My heart sank as I realized it was Jim. His face was pale, his eyes wide open in terror. I rushed to him, shaking his shoulders. "Jim, wake up!" He didn't move. His radio crackled faintly in his hand, but his grip was limp. I backed away, my breathing ragged, and that's when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hall. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight shaking. The figure emerged from the shadows, his face hidden beneath a hood. In his hand, he held something metallic, Jim's keys. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice breaking. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, his head tilting slightly as if studying me. I took a step back, my mind racing. "Listen, you can take whatever you want. Just leave us alone." He finally spoke, his voice low and unnervingly calm. "This isn't about money." "Then what?" I shouted. "You weren't supposed to be here tonight," he said, almost casually. "Neither of you." The words chilled me to my core. Before I could respond, he tossed the keys toward me. They clattered to the ground, the sound echoing in the narrow corridor. "Lock up when you leave," he said, turning and disappearing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see where he went. Grabbing Jim's keys, I dragged his limp body back to the office and locked the door. My hands shook as I called for help again, this time getting through. The cops arrived within minutes, but the man was long gone. They searched the mall and found nothing, no trace of him, no sign of forced entry, nothing. Jim was taken to the hospital, where he eventually woke up. He couldn't remember what had happened, just that he'd heard footsteps outside the office and blacked out. I quit the next day. Whatever that man's motives were, I didn't care. The mall wasn't just a building to me anymore. It was a trap, a place that felt alive and not in the way I'd ever want to experience again. Some nights, I think back to his words. "You weren't supposed to be here tonight." I wonder who was supposed to be there and if they'd been luckier than us. The fluorescent lights hummed above me as I leaned back in the cracked leather chair of the security office. It was my first night shift at the old DESMOND PLAZA, a towering relic of the 70s, now half abandoned. The air inside was cold, not the crisp kind of winter cold, but a stagnant chill that seemed to linger in forgotten corners. My co-worker, Barry, had left me a checklist before clocking out early. "Just make your rounds," he'd said. "Keep an eye on the 6th floor. It's weird up there." I laughed, thinking it was just a rookie initiation scare. By 2 a.m., the building was silent except for the occasional groan of metal as the wind rattled the windows. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam slicing through the shadows as I headed to the 6th floor. The elevator creaked its way up, the digital numbers blinking slowly, almost hesitantly, as if it too didn't want to go there. When the doors slid open, a musty smell hit me, like damp wood and mildew. The corridor stretched out before me, lined with empty offices and yellowed wallpaper peeling in jagged strips. I walked, my footsteps muffled by the aging carpet. Midway down the hall, I stopped. A door at the end, room 612, was slightly ajar, though I was sure I'd locked everything earlier. "Who's there?" I called, my voice firm but carrying that edge of doubt that betrays confidence. No answer. I pushed the door open and found a desk in the center of the room, its surface littered with old files and dusty photographs. A single chair faced the window, and on it sat a coat. It was gray, oversized, and hung limply, but what made my stomach twist was the fact that it was swaying ever so slightly, as if someone had just vacated it. The window was sealed shut. I backed out of the room, my flashlight beam catching movement. A figure darted across the hall, too fast to be human. My heart pounded as I shouted, "Who's there? This isn't funny!" Silence answered me, thick and oppressive. Then, from somewhere far off, I heard it. A whisper, faint, fragmented, and impossibly low, like it was seeping through the walls themselves. I turned off my flashlight. The faint whispering stopped immediately, leaving only the hum of the building's aged ventilation system. My breathing felt loud in the silence, but I told myself to keep calm. I didn't believe in ghosts. Barry must have set this up as some stupid prank. A shadow moving across the hall? Probably just my own reflection bouncing off a weird angle. Still, my feet hesitated before stepping back into the hallway. The air felt heavier here, like walking into a room where an argument just ended. As I approached the elevator, I heard a metallic clink behind me, a sound like keys falling to the floor. I turned sharply, the flashlight shaking in my grip. "All right, who's there?" My voice echoed down the corridor, but again there was no reply. Just the emptiness stretching back into dim shadows. I bent down to pick up the object. It wasn't keys. It was a small brass button, one of those old-fashioned kinds with ornate engravings. I examined it under the flashlight, my fingers brushing off its cold surface. My chest tightened as I remembered the coat in room 612, the same kind of buttons on its cuffs, That was it. Someone had to be messing with me. Suddenly, a voice spoke from behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, my flashlight catching a man leaning casually against the wall. He was tall and dressed like he'd stepped out of another decade. Gray slacks, suspenders, and a wrinkled shirt. His face was pale, almost sickly, with deep-set eyes that didn't quite match his smirk. "You're not supposed to be on this floor," he said again, his voice low and deliberate. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound tougher than I felt. "Just a concerned citizen," he said with a shrug, pushing off the wall. He walked toward me slowly, his shoes silent on the carpet. "This building has rules, you know. Unwritten ones." I stepped back, the flashlight beam trembling between us. "Look, I'm security here. If you don't have a reason to be in this building, you need to leave." He stopped a few feet away, tilting his head like he was studying me. Then, with a faint chuckle, he said, "I hope you're faster than the last one." I didn't wait to ask what he meant. I turned and bolted for the elevator. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, and each step felt slower than the last. The elevator doors finally came into view, but when I pressed the call button, nothing happened. I slammed it again and again, sweat pooling at the back of my neck. Behind me, the man's footsteps echoed softly, calm and unhurried. "You can't run forever," he said, his voice drifting toward me like a warning. The elevator refused to come, the button's light flickering with every press. I spun around, backing against the cold metal doors as the man walked closer. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. "Stay back," I barked, raising the flashlight in my trembling hand. He didn't stop. "Why are you so nervous?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. "This is your building, isn't it? You're the one who's supposed to be in charge." I scanned the hallway for an escape route and spotted the emergency stairwell just past him. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but you need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. His smirk faded. "You think I'm the problem here?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled photo. He tossed it onto the ground in front of me, and I couldn't help but glance down. The image was black and white, grainy, but unmistakable. It was the hallway I was standing in, only the walls were cleaner and the carpet looked new. "What the hell is this?" I asked, not taking my eyes off him. "This building is a tomb," he said, his voice flat now. "People come here to disappear. You're just the next one they sent to keep watch while they clean up the mess." A sharp chill spread through my body, not from fear but from recognition. The faces of the people in the photo were eerily familiar. One of them was Barry, my co-worker who had clocked out early. "You're lying," I said, shaking my head. The man shrugged. "Why don't you go check the basement if you don't believe me? That's where they hide everything they don't want found." Something about the way he said it, calm, detached, unnerved me more than the photo itself. I didn't want to believe him, but the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place too easily. Barry's strange behavior, the warnings about the 6th floor, the missing reports about people who worked here before me. I darted past him toward the stairwell, ignoring the sound of his laughter behind me. My footsteps echoed as I descended the stairs, skipping multiple steps at a time. When I reached the basement, the smell hit me first, an overwhelming stench of decay that made my stomach churn. The basement was darker than the rest of the building, lit only by a single flickering bulb. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets and shelves stacked with boxes. But it wasn't the cabinets or the boxes that caught my attention. It was the tarp-covered shapes on the floor. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. Pulling back the edge of the nearest tarp, I staggered back. Underneath was a body, partially decomposed, dressed in a familiar gray uniform. Barry's uniform. Footsteps echoed on the stairs behind me, but they weren't slow this time. They were quick, purposeful. I whipped around, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. It wasn't the man. It was someone else, dressed in a suit, their face obscured by shadows. "You shouldn't have come down here," the voice said, cold and clinical, and then everything went black.